She was 21 and unwanted. No inheritance she could claim, no father to speak for her, no mother to write to, just a small trunk of clothes, a tin of her grandmother's sewing needles, and 11 pounds and 6 shillings sewn into the hem of her traveling cloak. And with those few pounds and that quiet trunk, Laura Brooks was sent north by a duke to a roofless former abbey called Wetherby, given to her not as a gift but as a way of being forgotten. But what nobody knew, not the duke and not the solicitor who drew up the papers, was that hidden inside that ruined stone shell, behind a shuttered range and beneath a broken cellar floor, was something that would not only change her life but overturn the very man who had discarded her. So settle in with a cup of something warm and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight, because this is a long, patient story and it is best told slowly. Laura Brooks had been born in a narrow parsonage in a village on the edge of the West Riding, the only child of a country curate who read Latin more comfortably than he spoke to his parishioners, and of a mother who died of a low fever in the winter. Laura turned 9. Her father lasted another 6 years after that, growing thinner in the shoulders and softer in the mind, until at last he was taken by a bad chest one wet spring, leaving his daughter, at 15, with a house that belonged to the parish, a shelf of theology books that belonged to no one, and a small legacy of 42 pounds that his own brother, a wine merchant in Leeds, quietly absorbed within a month of the funeral. She was not asked what she wanted. She was told what she would do. The Duke of Marsden, a distant patron of her father's who had once presented the curate to his living out of tepid family duty, arranged through his secretary that the orphaned girl should be placed as a companion in the household of his elderly aunt, Lady Ansell, in a tall grey house in York. And that was the fact of her life for the next 6 years. Companion, reader, mender, letter writer, and, when the housekeeper was ill, an unpaid second pair of hands in the still room and the linen press. It was in that house that she met the woman who shaped her. Mrs. Iris Hadfield was 63 when Laura arrived, a widow of a Dales joiner, and she had been Lady Ansell's housekeeper for 29 years. She was small and square-shouldered, with hands like scrubbed roots, and she spoke only when she had something to say. Mrs. Hadfield taught Laura how to bank a coal fire so it would hold overnight, how to lay a poultice of mustard and linseed for a bad chest, how to keep accounts in a plain ruled book with a single ink line under each week's total, how to graft a rose onto a briar stalk in early March, how to test old plaster with a knuckle, how to read the weather off the chimney smoke, and how to speak to a butcher's boy so he did not overcharge. She never called Laura clever, which Laura understood to be the highest of her compliments, and once, when Laura had spent a whole Sunday afternoon sorting the seed drawers in the cold pantry by size and color, Mrs. Hadfield had looked in from the doorway and said only, "You've a use for you, girl," and gone away again, and Laura had carried those 5 words with her ever since, like a coin in a pocket. The beloved object came from her mother. It was a small enameled thimble, blue as a hedge sparrow's egg, chipped along one edge where her mother had once caught it against the leg of a chair, and it lived in a folded square of gray flannel inside the tin of needles. Her mother had been a plain sewer of shirts and children's smocks for the village, and the thimble had been the only thing she owned that had cost more than a shilling. Laura had watched, at 8 years old, as her mother slipped it onto her middle finger to hem a christening gown for a neighbor, and the memory was so sharp, the low sun through the parsonage window, the smell of the coal and the clean linen, the tiny click of the needle against the enamel, that when Laura closed her eyes on cold nights in York, she could still fetch it up whole. When Lady Ansell died in the January of Laura's 21st year, and the house was closed up within a fortnight, and Mrs. Hadfield was pensioned off to her sister's cottage in Ripon with a shake of the hand and a plain black bonnet, Laura took the tin, the thimble, the ruled account book Mrs. Hadfield had given her, her mother's Bible, 3 day dresses, 1 Sunday dress, a shawl, and her father's small brass compass, and she waited in the emptied morning room for the Duke's man to tell her what would become of her next. She did not weep. She had learned by then that weeping in that house was a private thing. done into a pillow or into a scrubbing cloth, and never in a room where a decision was being made about her life. She folded her hands in her lap, and she watched the winter light move across the bare floorboards, and she counted, without quite meaning to, the number of small kindnesses she had been shown in 6 years, and found the number was not large, but that the ones she had were solid, and that Mrs. Hadfield's 5 words about her being of use were still, when weighed against everything else, the heaviest and the truest thing she owned. The Duke's man arrived on a Tuesday, an hour after noon, in a black frock coat that was clean but not new, and he sat down in the chair opposite Laura without being invited to sit, and laid a leather portfolio flat across his knees. His name was Mr. Pembridge, and he was the Duke's secretary in matters of small business, which meant, as Laura came to understand, that he handled the disposals, the closing of houses, the pensioning of servants, the placing of relatives and dependents who had ceased to be useful. He was not unkind. He was simply a man for whom she was one of 11 or 12 small matters to be settled that week, and he had, folded inside his portfolio, the paper that would settle her. He read it aloud in a level voice. His Grace the Duke of Marsden, in consideration of the long service of the late Reverend Brooks and of the affection of his late Aunt Lady Ansell for the young woman named herein, was pleased to grant to Miss Laura Brooks the use, for her natural life, of the property known as Wetherby Abbey, situated on the northern portion of the Marsden estate, together with such outbuildings, gardens, and appurtenances as pertained thereto, on condition that she reside there and make no further application to the Duke or to his household for maintenance, allowance, or introduction. There was a second sheet. Laura was to sign it. She was to acknowledge that she had received the grant in full satisfaction of any claim, expressed or implied, arising from her father's presentation to his living or from her residence with Lady Ansell. Laura did not ask what Wetherby Abbey was. She had heard the name once, at Lady Ansell's dinner table, spoken by a curate who had ridden past it and called it a picturesque ruin, and Lady Ansell had laughed and said it was a stone in the Duke's shoe. Laura understood, sitting in the emptied morning room with Mr. Pembridge's pen already uncapped, that she was being given the stone. She understood also that she was being given it in order that the Duke might set his foot down without discomfort for the remainder of his life. She read the paper herself, slowly, from the first line to the last. She asked one question, which was whether the grant included the right to let rooms or to receive persons at the property, and Mr. Pembridge, who had not expected a question, looked at the paper again and said that the grant did not forbid it. She signed her name, Laura Brooks, in a plain, even hand at the foot of the second sheet, and she blotted the signature herself with the strip of blotting paper Mr. Pembridge held out. He gave her a folded sheet with directions to the property, the name of the Duke's steward at the nearest market town, and a single sovereign, wrapped in tissue, which he said was for the coach. He did not shake her hand. He touched the brim of his hat in the hall, and he was gone before the case clock in the passage had struck the half-hour. Laura went upstairs and finished her packing. She put the tin of needles and the blue enameled thimble into the trunk between the folded shawl and the Sunday dress, where nothing could press them. She sewed the sovereign into the hem of her traveling cloak beside the £11 and 6 shillings that were already there, and she took a last cup of weak tea in the kitchen with the girl who had been left to shut the shutters, and she asked the girl to give her love to Mrs. Hadfield if ever she wrote to Ripon, and the girl said she would, and Laura believed her, because the girl had cried at Mrs. Hadfield's leaving, and Laura had not, and that difference seemed, in the emptied kitchen, to matter. She left York on the Thursday coach at 7 in the morning, in a thin grey rain that had not yet decided to be sleet. The coach was the northern mail as far as Thirsk and a slower carrier's cart after that, and she paid her fare from the sovereign and folded the change carefully into a small cloth purse she kept inside the bodice of her dress. Her trunk was strapped to the roof under a piece of tarred canvas, and she watched, from the window, the pale walls of the city drop behind her and the flat, wet fields of the Vale of York open out on either side, hedgerow after hedgerow, ditch after ditch, and above it all a low sky the color of pewter. She had never been so far north. She had never been out of the West Riding at all except twice. Once to a christening in Wakefield and once to a funeral in Barnsley. and both of those places had been within an afternoon's cart ride of the parsonage. Now the country changed under her hour by hour. The hedgerows thinned, the fields grew larger and stonier. Dry stone walls began to run over the low hills in long gray lines that seemed drawn by a single patient hand, and the villages grew further apart, and the churches in them squatter and older, with stubby towers and weathered lich gates and yew trees black against the wet sky. At Thirsk, she got down and ate a bowl of thin mutton broth in the tap room of a coaching inn while she waited for the carrier's cart. The broth was hot and cost 4p, and she was grateful for both those facts. The carrier was a red-faced man of about 50 named Mr. Denton, who drove a cart drawn by a heavy bay mare, and he lifted her trunk without comment and helped her onto the plank seat beside him with a hand as broad and calloused as a spade. He asked her where she was going. She said Wetherby Abbey. He looked at her sidelong for a moment, and then he looked at the mare's ears, and he said, "That's a wet spot, miss," and clicked his tongue, and they set off. The road climbed steadily. The rain thickened. Laura pulled the hood of her cloak forward and felt the sewn coins press against her wrist through the wool, and she watched the country turn from farmland into rougher pasture and then into open moor, with dark heather on either side and gray outcrops of stone breaking through the turf like the shoulders of buried animals. A curlew called somewhere out in the wet, a long, thin note that fell and rose and fell again, and Laura thought that she had never heard a lonelier sound, and also that it was, in its way, a beautiful one. Mr. Denton did not speak for long stretches. When he did, it was to name a farm, or a beck, or a low bridge, and she took each name in and put it away, because she understood that she was entering a country in which knowing the names of things would be, from that afternoon onward, part of how she stayed alive. They came over a low rise in the late afternoon, and Mr. Denton drew the mare in without a word, and pointed with the butt of his whip. And there, in a shallow fold of moor below them, Laura saw Wetherby Abbey for the first time. It sat inside a broken square of stone wall in about 4 acres of tangled ground, with a beck running along its western side, and a stand of dark yews at its northern end, and the building itself was longer than she had expected, and lower, made of a pale, gray local stone that had gone almost black on the weathered faces and was still pale where the wind had scoured it. The roof of the central range was gone entirely. She could see the sky through the tall lancet openings where windows had been, and where slates had once been laid, there were now only the bare timbers of 2 collapsed trusses and a great deal of nothing. The eastern range, a shorter wing running at a right angle, still had most of its roof, though slates were missing in patches and the ridge sagged. A stubby tower stood at the join of the 2 ranges, square, unglazed, with a leaded parapet gone green. They came down the track and stopped at what had once been a gatehouse and was now 2 stone piers holding no gate between them, and Mr. Denton lifted her trunk down onto the wet grass and asked whether she had anyone expected. She said she had not. He looked at the sky and at the Abbey and at Laura, and then he told her that his cart came out this way of a Thursday, and that if she wanted anything fetched from Thirsk, she was to leave word at the Ridley farm, half a mile back on the road, with Mrs. Ridley, who kept a slate for such messages. He touched his cap. The mare turned in the wet and the cart rattled off up the track, and Laura stood by her trunk with the rein on her cloak and looked at the place the Duke had given her. She walked the ground before she went inside. The outer wall was breached in 3 places, and stood in others to a height of 8 or 9 feet, of the same pale stone, laid without much mortar in the older courses, and repointed in one span with a coarser lime. Inside the wall there had once been a formal garden. She could see the ghost of it in the raised beds gone over to nettle and rosebay willow-herb, and in the paths marked out in flat stone slabs half sunk in moss, and in a broken sundial on a square plinth in what must have been the center. To the south lay a walled kitchen garden of about half an acre, with its own doorway, the door itself rotted at the base and swinging on one hinge, and inside the walled garden she saw espaliered pear trees, grown wild against the south wall, and the frames of what had been 3 cold frames, with the glass gone. The main door of the eastern range was oak, banded with black iron, and it opened when Laura pushed it, though with a scrape and a shudder. Inside there was a stone-flagged passage the length of the range, with rooms giving off it on the inner side. She counted 7 rooms in that wing. 2 of them were dry, the others had damp walls, and one had a fallen ceiling of lath and plaster lying in a heap on the boards. The kitchen was at the northern end of the wing, and had a great open hearth with an iron crane still in place, a bread oven set into the side of the chimney breast, a slate-topped table too heavy to have been moved, and a copper of about 20 gallons set into brickwork in the corner, greened but sound. The roofless central range was worse and better than she had feared. Worse, because there was no shelter in it at all, and the floor, where it survived, was a shifting layer of leaf mold and broken slate and pigeon lime 3 inches thick. Better, because the walls stood to their full height on 3 sides. The great east window still held the tracery of its lights, and the stone of the interior had not slumped or bulged. It could, she thought, be roofed again by someone with money, and she had none, but the fact that it could was worth something. The cloister on the south side of the central range still stood in 9 of its 12 bays, with pointed arches on slender columns, and along its inner wall she could see the outlines of the old stone benches. At the far end of the cloister, a heavy door opened into what she took to be the shuttered range Mr. Pembridge's paper had referred to only as the disused wing. The door was padlocked with a padlock so rusted it had ceased to be a lock and become a lump of iron. Laura made a note of it in her head and went back to the eastern range to sleep. She slept the first night on her folded cloak in the driest of the 2 dry rooms, a small chamber with a boarded window and a swept hearth, and she woke in the gray before dawn with her breath showing in the air, and she set about surviving. Over the first fortnight she cleaned the kitchen, laid a fire in the great hearth with wood dragged in from the yard, boiled water in the copper, scrubbed the slate table, and moved her sleeping place from the small chamber to a larger one further down the passage that had a working fireplace and a bedstead with its ropes still sound. She walked to Mrs. Ridley's farm and bought milk and eggs and half a stone of oatmeal on account. And Mrs. Ridley, a stout woman of about 40 with red hands, wrote it in a slate against Laura's name and said nothing when Laura counted out the pennies for the first week. In the second week, Laura took a hammer and a cold chisel from a rusted tool cupboard in the kitchen and went to the padlocked door at the end of the cloister and knocked the hasp off the stone with 3 careful blows. The door opened onto a passage that smelt of stopped air. The shuttered range was 2 stories of small rooms above a run of cellars, and every window was closed with a wooden internal shutter, and every shutter was still latched. Laura opened them one by one and let the light in on rooms that had been left as if for an afternoon and never returned to. A ladder-back chair stood by a cold grate. A bed had its curtains still tied. On a shelf in what had been a bookroom stood a row of estate ledgers in calf bindings, and on a small table beneath the window lay a folded newspaper dated the 4th of November, 1826, and a china cup with a brown ring in the bottom. Laura went through the rooms without touching anything for the first hour, and only then began to sort. The cellars were reached by a stair from the back passage. The first 2 were dry storerooms with empty racks. The third had a floor of stone flags that had heaved and cracked, and along the north wall, a section of about 6 feet by 4 had fallen away entirely into a shallow pit. Laura climbed down into the pit with a lantern and found, tucked into a niche in the wall that had been hidden by the flags, a tin document box the size of a small trunk and, wrapped in oiled cloth beside it, a leather satchel with a brass buckle. She carried them both up to the kitchen, set them on the slate table, and opened the tin box first. Inside were papers tied in bundles with red tape, the original deed of the abbey, a schedule of tithe rents payable from 4 named farms on the northern edge of the estate, to the holder of Wetherby Abbey in perpetuity, a bundle of receipts for those rents paid up to the year 1824 and then broken off, an old award under the Enclosure Act granting to the abbey a common right on 230 acres of moor at Wetherby Edge, and, folded at the bottom, a letter addressed in a fine sloping hand to whoever finds this. The letter was signed Miss Honor Whitfield, spinster of Wetherby Abbey. She wrote that she had lived at the Abbey 41 years, that she had been the last of her family to hold it, and had held it under a settlement of her grandfather's which the present Duke's father had contested, and she believed suppressed, that she had put the papers where she put them, because she trusted stone more than she trusted men in frock coats, that the leather satchel contained 118 sovereigns saved out of the tithe rents of the 4 farms between 1810 and 1824, that she left it and the papers to whoever came next to live under this roof, because a house that had been made small by unkindness ought one day to be made large again by someone willing to do the work, and that she hoped, whoever they were, they had known the love of one person in their life who had thought them worth the trouble. She hoped that above all. Laura sat down on the bench by the hearth with the letter in her lap. She read it a second time. Then she took the tin of needles from her pocket and unfolded the gray flannel and set the blue enameled thimble on the slate table beside the open satchel of sovereigns, and she sat for a long while with her hands quiet in her lap and the fire ticking in the grate. In the morning, Laura took a clean sheet from the middle of the ruled account book Mrs. Hadfield had given her and wrote at the top of it. In the plain hand Mrs. Hadfield had taught her, Wetherby Abbey, and beneath that the date, and beneath that 3 columns headed repairs, rents, and visitors. She wrote nothing under the 3rd column yet. Under repairs, she listed the eastern range roof, the cloister, the kitchen garden wall, the shuttered wing shutters, and the sundial. Under rents, she wrote the names of the 4 farms Miss Honor Whitfield had named, and beside each she left space for a figure. She closed the book, tied it with a length of red tape from the tin box, and put it on the mantel shelf above the great hearth. She walked that day to Mrs. Ridley's farm and paid what she owed in full from a single sovereign taken from the leather satchel, and she asked Mrs. Ridley whether there was a man in the parish who understood slate. Mrs. Ridley named Mr. Isaac Fenwick, a slater of 58 from the village of Low Wetherby, and said his son worked with him and neither drank. Laura wrote the name in the back of the account book. She asked also for a mason, and Mrs. Ridley named Mr. Thomas Peel, 61, who had rebuilt the churchyard wall the winter before last. She asked for a gardener, and Mrs. Ridley thought a moment and said Mrs. Anne Sowerby, 44, widow, who kept the vicarage garden and knew old fruit trees better than anyone in the Dale. Mr. Fenwick came on the Monday with his son Robert, who was 22, and they walked the eastern range roof in their stockinged feet and counted 83 slates gone and 4 rafters soft at the ends. Mr. Fenwick quoted Laura £7 and 12 shillings for the slates, the lime, the laths, the 4 scarfed rafters, and the labor of himself and Robert for a fortnight. Laura paid him £3 down from the satchel and the rest on completion, and she wrote the sum against repairs in the ruled book with a single ink line under it in the way Mrs. Hadfield had shown her. Mr. Peel came on the Wednesday and looked at the kitchen garden wall and the breaches in the outer wall and quoted £5 for both, working in local lime with pale grey stone gathered from the fallen courses on the ground. He brought his own hod, his own trowel, his own line and pins, and he brought a boy called Ned, 13, whose work was to sort the stones by size against the foot of the wall. Mr. Peel worked slowly and did not speak while he worked. On the 3rd day he said to Laura, without turning, "This lime's honest." She took that as praise and wrote nothing in the book about it. Mrs. Sowerby came on foot from Low Wetherby with a spade tied across her back and a canvas satchel of cuttings and dormant grafts, and she walked the tangled formal garden and the walled kitchen garden without speaking for nearly an hour. Then she asked Laura what she wanted the ground to be. Laura said she wanted the kitchen garden to feed the house within a year, and the formal garden to be worth walking in within 2. Mrs. Sowerby said that could be done, and named £2 a month for 3 days a week, which Laura wrote in the book and paid at the end of each month in coin from the satchel. They cleared the raised beds first, cutting the nettle at the root with a sickle, forking out the willow herb, and burning what would burn on a slow heap by the beck. Mrs. Sowerby pruned the espaliered pears against the south wall with a curved knife, took out the dead wood, tied the leaders to fresh nails, and grafted 3 new scions of a russet she had brought from the vicarage onto the strongest stock. Laura worked beside her in a canvas apron over her plainest dress and learned the knife by watching. Robert Fenwick, on the roof of the eastern range, called down once that the ridge was true again, and Mr. Peel, at the kitchen garden wall, straightened and looked and said nothing. By the end of the first month, the eastern range was watertight. The kitchen garden wall stood square along its southern face, and the beds inside it were black and turned. Laura wrote the totals in the ruled book, drew her single ink line under the week, and slept that night without waking. In the second month, a woman called Miss Harriet Ingle, 34, unmarried, the schoolmistress of Low Weatherby, walked up the track on a Saturday afternoon with a basket of flat oatcakes wrapped in a cloth and asked whether she might see the cloister. Laura took her round it, and Miss Ingle stood a long time under the 9th bay and said the arches were finer than anything within 20 miles. She asked whether Laura would object to her bringing the older girls of the school on a Wednesday to draw them. Laura said she would not, and Miss Ingle came back on the Wednesday with 11 girls in pinafores and a bundle of slates, and they sat along the low stone benches and drew the columns while Miss Ingle moved between them and corrected the lines. The following Saturday, 2 of the girls' mothers walked up with them, and the Saturday after that, a farmer called Mr. Josiah Metcalf, 57, of the northernmost of the 4 tithe farms, came with his wife to see what young woman had taken the abbey. Laura made them tea in the kitchen at the slate-top table, and did not, at that first meeting, mention the tithe. Mr. Metcalf walked the cloister with his hat in his hand, and said his grandfather had come to service in the chapel when he was a boy. Laura wrote his name in the book that evening. She had by then engaged Mr. Alfred Waring, a solicitor of Thirsk of about 50, on the recommendation of Mrs. Ridley's brother-in-law. Mr. Waring came out by the carrier's cart of a Thursday, sat at the slate-topped table, read Miss Honor Whitfield's papers through twice without speaking, and then said, in a dry voice, that the schedule of tithe rents was a good document, and that the enclosure award was a better one. He undertook, for a fee of 4 guineas, to lodge copies with the court at York, to write to the 4 named farms, and to write, separately and with great civility, to the Duke of Marsden's steward. Laura paid him 2 guineas on account, and wrote the rest against the fee in the ruled book. Mr. Waring's letters went out on a Monday. By the second Thursday, 3 of the 4 farmers had written back acknowledging the rent and asking only what date suited for the first payment. Mr. Metcalf drove up in person with £14 in a canvas bag and set it on the slate table, and said he had always thought it queer that the payment stopped, and Laura wrote £14 under rents and drew her line. The 4th farmer, an older man called Mr. Ezra Halton, 69, wrote that he did not dispute the paper, but that his harvest had been thin and would Miss Brooks accept half now and half at Martinmas. Laura wrote back in her own hand that she would, and she wrote it also in the book, exactly as agreed. The Duke's steward did not answer at all for 6 weeks, and then wrote a short letter saying only that his Grace was abroad, and the matter would be considered on his return. Mr. Waring told Laura this was, in effect, a concession, because it did not deny the paper. He said the Duke would not now contest what 4 tenants had already paid. Meanwhile, the shuttered wing was opened room by room. Robert Fenwick reslated the small roof over the book-room in a single day. Mr. Peel repointed the chimney of the ladder-back bedchamber. Mrs. Sowerby's eldest daughter, Alice, 18, came up 3 days a week and helped Laura wash the boards with soft soap and hot water, beat the curtains in the yard, and turn the ticking mattresses in the sun. A woman from Low Weatherby, called Mrs. Grace Turnbull, 49, seamstress, made new plain linen hangings for 2 of the small beds at 8d. the yard, and would take no more. Laura wrote her name in the book under repairs and paid her in coin at the door. By midsummer, 6 rooms of the shuttered wing were slept in on occasion by visiting girls from the school, by Miss Ingle, and once by Mrs. Hadfield herself, who came from Ripon by the mail as far as Thirsk, and by Mr. Denton's cart the rest of the way, and who walked through the whole abbey without saying much, and at the end, sitting by the great hearth, said only, "You've a use for you, girl," and drank her tea. Laura opened the gardens formally on a Saturday in July. She had written out a small handbill by hand, and Miss Ingle had copied it in a neat clerkly hand onto 20 sheets, which Mr. Denton had left at the inns at Thirsk, Ripon, and Bedale on his rounds. The handbills said that the gardens and cloisters of Wetherby Abbey would be open on Saturday afternoons from 2 until 6, that admission was 3p for adults and a penny for children, that tea and oatcakes could be had in the kitchen for a further 2p, and that the proceeds went to the upkeep of the fabric. On the first Saturday, 41 people came. On the second, 68. On the third, 119. And Laura had to ask Alice Sowerby and 2 of the school's older girls to help serve tea in the kitchen. They came in carts, on foot, and, later in the summer, in gigs from as far as North Allerton. They walked the cloister, they sat on the stone benches, they looked up through the empty tracery of the great east window at the sky. They wandered the raised beds of the formal garden and the neat lines of the kitchen garden. They ate oatcakes from Miss Ingall's recipe on plates borrowed from Mrs. Ridley, and they paid their 3p into a plain tin box on the slate table. Laura wrote each Saturday's total in the ruled book beside the date, and by the end of August, the third column, which had begun empty, ran down a whole page. By autumn, Laura was known in 3 parishes by name. She was Miss Brooks of the Abbey. Mr. Denton, on his Thursday round, no longer needed to ask where she was going with the parcels tied to the roof of the cart, because everyone at the coaching inn at Thirsk knew, and the parcels were addressed to her simply in that form and reached her without loss. Mrs. Ridley kept a slate for her still, but the slate was mostly clean now, because Laura paid weekly on a Friday afternoon and walked back up the track with a full basket over her arm. Small rituals settled around the house without being planned. On Wednesday afternoons, Miss Ingall brought the school's older girls to draw in the cloister, and Laura made a pot of weak tea for Miss Ingall in the kitchen while the girls worked. On Thursday mornings, Mr. Denton set down her parcels at the gatehouse and drank a cup of black tea at the slate table before turning the mare back down the track. On Friday evenings, Mrs. Sowerby stayed to supper and ate a plate of bread and cheese with Laura by the fire, and they spoke of the beds and the trees, and sometimes of nothing. On Saturday afternoons the gardens were open, and on Sunday mornings Laura walked down to Low Wetherby to the parish church and sat in the 3rd pew from the back, and the vicar, Mr. Edward Loft, 62, greeted her at the porch by name. The tithes came in quarterly now, entered in the ruled book in Laura's plain hand and countersigned by Mr. Waring at Michaelmas. The Saturday admissions came in weekly. Between the two, the account book showed by November a working income against which Laura could plan the re-roofing of the central range in the spring. Mr. Fenwick had already stood in the empty nave with her, and paced the length and reckoned, in his slow way, that a plain slate roof over new pine trusses could be had for something under £60 if the stone bore the weight, which he thought it would. The Duke's steward wrote once more in October, this time in a longer letter, to say that His Grace, on consideration, did not propose to disturb the arrangements Miss Brooks had made with the 4 tenants, and that His Grace understood the property to be well maintained. Mr. Waring read the letter aloud to Laura at the slate table and permitted himself a small smile at the corner of his mouth. He said that was, in the language of such letters, a full surrender. Laura folded the letter and put it in the tin document box on top of Miss Honor Whitfield's papers, and she wrote nothing in the ruled book about it because there was nothing to enter. She had by then hired a girl of 16 called Bessie Harker, of Low Wetherby, as a maid-of-all-work at £4 a year with board, and she had asked Mrs. Hadfield, by letter to Ripon, whether Mrs. Hadfield would consider coming for the winter to keep house properly, and Mrs. Hadfield had written back on a single sheet in her small square hand that she would come at Martinmas and stay until Lady Day and see how it suited. Laura had aired the largest of the dry rooms in the eastern range for her and set a chair by its hearth. People in the villages had begun to speak of the Abbey, not as the ruin at Wetherby, but as Miss Brooks's house, and the change of phrase had happened without anyone marking it, in the way such changes do. When a woman in Bedale Market asked Mr. Denton whether the young lady at Wetherby was the Duke's ward, he said, without pausing, "She's the lady of the Abbey," and turned back to his sacks. The phrase travelled. By the time the first snow fell on the moor above Weatherby Edge, it was the phrase used at the Ridley farm, at the inn at Thirsk, and in the vestry at Low Weatherby, and Laura, who heard it once from behind her in the churchyard, did not turn to see who had said it, because the saying of it belonged more to them than to her. On the evening of Mrs. Hadfield's arrival at Martinmas, Laura sat by the great hearth in the eastern range with the ruled account book open on her knee and the tin document box at her feet. On the slate-top table lay two things she had put there on purpose: the blue enameled thimble in its square of gray flannel, chipped along one edge where it had once caught the leg of a chair in a parsonage on the edge of the West Riding, and beside it the folded letter of Miss Honor Whitfield, spinster of Weatherby Abbey, who had trusted stone more than men in frock coats. Two women she had never met, one her mother, and one a stranger dead before she was born, had between them furnished the whole of her inheritance. Mrs. Hadfield, sitting opposite in the chair Laura had set for her, drank her tea and said nothing, which was the highest praise she gave. The Duke, somewhere abroad, had wished to forget her. 4 parishes, 1 carrier, 1 slater, 1 mason, 1 gardener, 1 schoolmistress, and a girl of 16 had, without declaring it, remembered her instead. Laura Brooks was 21. And she had £11 and 6 shillings and a tin of needles when a duke sent her north to be rid of her, and she spent that inheritance on a roofless abbey. It was the best inheritance she ever spent. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs it, and tell us, what place in your own life did others call ruined before you saw what it could become?